Hey students, welcome to Unit 5, Dependent Clauses and Complex Sentences. We're going to go ahead and get started with what I think are the easiest of the three types of clauses that we'll talk about in Unit 5, which are called adverb clauses. So before we jump into that, let's talk about what a clause is, and then specifically narrow it down to adverb clauses for today. So a clause is a word group that has a subject and it has a verb, but it does not make sense by itself. So it has a subject and a verb, just like an independent clause does, but it does not make sense by itself. Clauses create what we call complex sentences. So we've talked about how we have simple sentences, right? A subject and a verb in a sense of completeness. And then we also have compound sentences, which was what Unit 4 was. Now we're talking about complex sentences, okay? Every clause is used like a single word or part of speech, okay? So these clauses today are called adverb clauses, but they are being used like a single part of speech, like an adverb. And that'll make more sense when we look at some examples. There are three types of clauses: adjective clauses, adverb clauses, and noun clauses. Today we're talking about adverb clauses, and they are, in my opinion, the easiest of the three to identify, to work with, to use, just everything, okay? Now, all clauses typically begin with what we call signal words. Just like a signal on the street, if it's a red light, yellow light, or green light, signal a driver to do something. A signal in a clause signals a writer or a reader to do something, okay? So adverbs and adverb clauses are a part of speech that modifies or explains verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. A single adverb does the same thing. And that is from way back when we learned parts of speech, okay? Quite simply, the way I like to think of it is adverbs add, and I know it's spelled wrong, they add to verbs. Or you could think of it like this. Adverbs in some way are modifying a verb, okay? Often, and we learn this when we're in elementary and middle school, adverbs end in ly. For example, quietly or respectfully, right? It ends in an ly. Adverb and adverb clauses answer the following questions: when, where, why, how, on what condition, and under what condition. Adverb clauses have certain characteristics or traits about them that make them, in my opinion, easier to find and easier to identify, which is why I find that they are the simplest of the three. So as we look at our next note here, it's talking about the characteristics of adverb clauses. In other words, these groups of words that have a subject and a verb but don't make sense by themselves. So how can we distinguish them from an adjective or noun clause? Well, it's kind of tough to think about that since we haven't learned those yet. But nevertheless, let's talk about their characteristics. First of all, an adverb clause can be moved around in a sentence. And we'll show you some examples of that with some sentences in just a bit. Also, a comma is needed after an adverb clause when it begins a sentence. So here's an example. When I arrived at school, Mr. Eating had bagels to thank the teachers. So here it is. When I arrived at school, notice it has a comma, but we could move this around. We could say, Mr. Eating had bagels to thank the teachers when I arrived at school. So an adverb clause, the way that you can distinguish it from an adjective clause is that it can be moved around in a sentence. And one more note here, adverb clauses begin with what we call subordinating conjunctions. So what's interesting about this is this word conjunction hopefully is familiar because we learned about coordinating conjunctions, the fanboys. We also learned about conjunctive adverbs. Subordinating conjunctions, that means like to be lower than or less in rank than. So a subordinating conjunction begins an adverb clause, and it is the word, it's actually adding a word to make that less than a sentence. For example, I arrived at school. The subordinating conjunction is the word when. By adding the subordinating conjunction when, you take something that was a complete sentence, I arrived at school, and you make it less than a sentence. So it subordinates that clause into less of a sentence. When I arrived at school. It seems kind of counterintuitive that by adding words, we're actually making it less than a sentence, but that's what that one means. Okay, so we have a couple more things for these notes. It looks really lengthy, but it truly is not. It's just helpful stuff to make sure we understand adverb clauses. Subordinating conjunction stuff. So subordinating conjunctions show more specifically the relationship between two facts or the ideas that they are connecting than a coordinating conjunction does, like and, but, or, and all of the fanboys, right? A subordinating conjunction joins a subordinate clause to a main clause. Here is a list of really common subordinating conjunctions. Notice that in that example about Mr. Eating and the bagels, there's the when, right? So that's a subordinating conjunction. Okay, and there are a bunch of others here. Now, an adverb clause is always introduced by a subordinating conjunction. Noun clauses and adjective clauses sometimes are, but an adverb clause is always introduced by one of these subordinating conjunctions. Okay? For example, before you go, sign the logbook. So there's that subordinating conjunction. Noun clause, he asked if he could leave early. Adjective clause, that is the place where he was last seen. So we haven't really talked about noun clauses and adjective clauses yet. So if this is kind of confusing you, just simplify it, take a step back. We're only talking about adverb clauses here, but it's good to know that there are three different types that we will be eventually looking at. A subordinating conjunction is always followed by a clause. Many subordinating conjunctions can be other parts of speech. For example, adverb. Jill came tumbling after. Preposition. Jill came tumbling after Jack. As a subordinating conjunction, Jill came tumbling after Jack had fallen. And the purpose of putting that in there, and we've talked about this before, is that different words have different roles. Just like I have this role of being a teacher, but I also have a role of being a mother. And in different contexts, so at home, I don't act like a teacher, I act like a mom. And when I'm at school, most of the time I act like a teacher. I don't act like a mom, but I'm still the same person. So when you take a word like after, it's the same word, just like I'm the same person, but it's playing a different role. And in this case, it's just saying it's playing the role of a different part of speech. So when we look at the practice, there are two parts to it. They want us to, on the top half, indicate if the following word groups are a complete sentence, that means it has a subject and a verb and a sense of completeness, or if it's acting as an adverb clause. A really big indicator is that, well, it won't have a sense of completeness, but remember, an adverb clause always has a subordinating conjunction. Down here in number 6 through 15, they want us to underline the adverb clause and label the main subject and verbs and verb or verbs in each sentence. So let's do some practice, no pressure. It's not a quiz or a test right now. The purpose is to take the notes and the information that we just learned and wrote about and apply it to some practice.